Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 29th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past that honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. Last time, we followed Pompey as he rose to prominence in Rome's first major civil war, serving under the dictator Sulla and gathering for himself the epithet of the Great at a comically young age. He also managed to pick up less flattering nickname, reflecting the brutality with which he persecuted the last members of the Marian faction. His enemies hung the name the Teenage Butcher onto young Pompey, which was slightly unfair, but only because he wasn't a teenager. The butcher part was definitely accurate. After the Civil War and his triumph, Pompey enjoyed his status as the number 2 guy in Rome. His stature got an upgrade when Sulla died, and it was to Pompey that the state turned in 77 BCE when 2 guys named Brutus and Lepidus organized a harebrained civil war in an attempt to seize the state by force, just as Sulla had done. Pompey organized his armies, marched around, knocked these bumbling usurpers senseless, and once again was hailed as the savior of his country. It was a good time to be Pompey. But Pompey did not have long to rest on his laurels. Last week, I mentioned that the Marian Revolution had been extinguished everywhere but Spain. This was the last theater of war in the Civil War, and while events at Rome might have seemed settled, this festering conflict was proving to be nearly impossible to extinguish. The problem for Rome was that Spain, or to be precise, the province of Hispania, had been seized by the Marian general Quintus Sertorius. Sertorius had been a soldier of considerable distinction in the Social War. Then during the series of prologue engagements that led to the Civil War, he was a member of the Marian faction. But he was frustrated by the brutality and lack of order that the regime led the campaign with. After Cinna was murdered by his own troops, Sertorius seems to have been sick of the leaders of the faction, and they seemed sick of him too. He was particularly galled with the move to make the 27-year-old and entirely inexperienced Gaius Marius the Younger consul in 82 BCE. The leaders of the Marian faction ordered Sertorius to go to Hispania and recover the province for the regime. For a group of people who made a series of astoundingly poor choices, this one proved to be inspired, as Sertorius was an extremely capable general, a shrewd strategist, and a brilliant tactician. The campaigns of Sertorius are full of drama, intrigue, cunning, and deception. He essentially carried on a one-man war, building local alliances, scraping together a guerrilla army, teaming up with pirates, and generally doing anything he could to conquer Hispania. As a side note, the Roman provinces of Hispania were not the entire Iberian Peninsula as we would think of the country of Spain today. Rather, Hispania Cistercior and Hispania Ulterior largely hugged the southern coast of the Iberian Peninsula and also included the Balearic Islands. By 80 BCE, Sertorius was firmly established on the mainland, and in 77 BCE he drove the governor, Metellus Pius, out of the province of Hispania Ulterior. You may remember this Metellus as one of the ardent Sullan partisans, one of the key figures of the conservative party in Rome. Metellus had been Sulla's consular colleague in 80 BCE, the year Sulla resigned the dictatorship, and was from an ancient and pedigreed noble family. He represented everything the oligarchs stood for and everything the populists stood against. While he was in this fight, Sertorius' deputy likewise drove the Roman governor out of Hispania Cistercior. Their defeat at the hands of the renegade Sertorius was too much for the Senate to handle. Something had to be done. There was really only one person to whom they could turn: Pompey Magnus. In 76 BCE, right around the time that he finally turned 30, Pompey was given a proconsular, again, the authority of a consul without actually holding the office, command, and was tasked with doing whatever was necessary to end this roiling feud in Hispania. This command, which bestowed on Pompey consular rank, came a full dozen years before he would have been eligible to stand for the office. It's worth noting that by this point, Pompey had actually never held any formal office, consul or otherwise, but his country felt it needed a savior, so again it turned to its golden child. Once again, he turned to his veterans, and burnished by his towering reputation as Rome's greatest living general, Pompey quickly recruited and equipped a force in the tens of thousands, including 1,000 cavalry, and smugly marched off for Spain, confident of his victory. By this time, Metellus had developed a bit of a reputation as overly cautious and slow-moving. The more ambitious Pompey was always itching for action. In short order, he camped near Sertorius' army and confidently forecast victory. Metellus had regrouped with his army, but he was at present far off. For his part, Sertorius was cautious, avoiding open conflict and contenting himself with an ongoing guerrilla raids and harassing tactics. These began to pay dividends by making it harder and harder for Pompey to feed his army of 30,000. The Pompeian foraging parties had to move further and further away from the camp to find food to feed the army. These parties were not unarmed gatherers picking up whatever they came across. Rather, foraging was an assignment given to fully equipped troops who marched their way here and there, commandeering whatever they needed, loading up carts, and marching them back to camp. At one point, Sertorius waited for Pompey's foragers to stray far away from camp, then waited further still until they loaded themselves up with provisions. When they were thus burdened, only then Sertorius attacked, and the entire party was in danger of being wiped out. Pompey frantically sent reinforcements, but Sertorius had been waiting for this moment and quickly deployed his troops to surround and slaughter that detachment. While all this was happening, Pompey was essentially pinned down in his camp. If he sallied out to rescue his men, he would have left his rear vulnerable. If he did nothing, a huge contingent of his army faced annihilation. Faced with a no-win dilemma, Pompey elected to stay put and abandon his troops to their fate. All told, 10,000 of Pompey's men were cut down, helpless, surrounded. Sertorius had lulled Pompey into a trap and in one fell swoop wiped out 1/3 of the huge force Pompey had organized for the campaign. Had Metellus not trundled onto the scene to drive off Sertorius, the whole game could have been over for Pompey right then and there. Fortunately for the young Pompey, his older colleague did show up just in time to prevent such a catastrophe. In the modern world, we think of luck as something that we didn't earn. In the ancient world, luck was the sign of the favor of the gods. Pompey was lucky. This was not to his detriment, but to his credit. The gods had intervened to save him. Pompey licked his wounds, though. This battle, called the Battle of Lauron, for the city outside of whose walls it was fought, was a disaster for Pompey. But all was not lost. He still had a huge army, and more importantly, he learned his lesson. No more would he charge headlong into battle, convinced of the inevitability of his success. Greatness wasn't predetermined. It had to be earned, and Pompey was determined to be and to stay the great. Pompey settled in for a long fight. And that is what he got. A brutal guerrilla war in which Pompey and Sertorius slugged it out. Pompey always looking for but never finding the death blow. Sertorius always trying to land a trap for Pompey but never quite able to repeat Lauron. When Sertorius was in command, things generally went well for Sertorius. In another stirring victory in 75 BCE, Sertorius managed to isolate and slaughter 6,000 of Pompey's troops, including their commander, Pompey's brother-in-law, Gaius Memmius. The problem for Sertorius was that he was fighting not one, but two consular armies, one each under Pompey and Metellus. If he was fighting only one or the other, Sertorius would have had an advantage, but he was limited in his movements and his ability to engage. In many cases, Sertorius had to divide his forces and leave these units in command of subordinates. Sertorius was a man of exceptional talent and genius, truly one of the greatest generals of ancient Rome. We shouldn't hold it against him that his deputies weren't his equal. These detachments often came out the worst when they had to stand fight against Metellus or Pompey. The war in Hispania dragged on. Defying Pompey's expectation of a quick victory, the Sertorian War just kept going, showing no signs of abating. By 73 BCE, the Senate sent 2 more legions to bolster their forces, and Sertorius was seriously outgunned. Still, he kept moving, popping up and striking in one place before disappearing, only to turn up and strike again somewhere completely different. Sertorius managed to defy all attempts to subdue him. Then Pompey and Metellus got a stroke of, for them, remarkable good luck. What ultimately felled Sertorius was not his senatorial adversaries, nor even disease or old age or wounds from a battle. A jealous subordinate, convinced he could do better than his commander, assassinated Sertorius in 71 BCE. When Sertorius' will was read out, the crowd was stunned to hear that he had named his assassin as his chief beneficiary, which only served to highlight his treachery. Many people simply called it quits and left the field. This guy, Marcus Perperna, then proceeded to botch the war effort and was easily bested by Pompey and Metellus. Just like this, that never-ending war shuddered to a rapid and unexpected close, and after 5 long years, Pompey could finally claim complete victory, head home, mission accomplished. The genius of Sertorius didn't derail Pompey's career in the long run. In fact, the timing of everything ended up working out just perfectly, and Pompey's string of luck would continue. While Pompey was off fighting in Hispania, the Roman world was shaken to its core by the outbreak of the largest and most widespread of Rome's slave rebellions, the Third Servile War. This particular war is quite famous in the popular imagination, and it is better known as the Spartacus War, after its leader. Starting with a small band of fellow slaves, Spartacus, who had escaped from a gladiator training school using kitchen utensils to fight his way out, strung together victory after victory. Inspired by each success, more and more slaves revolted, fled from or murdered their masters, and joined the growing revolution. At its peak, Spartacus's army nearly 100,000. Every unit the Romans sent against them was crushed, and they appeared unstoppable. Rampaging across southern Italy, the Spartacus army moved north and seemed to be making a break across the Alps and out of Roman reach. Just when it seemed likely that Spartacus would lead his army to freedom, they inexplicably turned south and marched back into Italy. Everything the Senate had tried to do to contain this threat had failed. By this time, our old friend Crassus had risen to become the richest citizen in Rome. But for all his financial successes, he had longed for military glory. Seeing an opportunity to save Rome from the horrors and humiliations of Spartacus, Crassus poured his limitless financial resources into raising and equipping a massive army of 40,000 soldiers. He drilled them and marched them at the enemy. At first, his army fared poorly, with several detachments fleeing from battle. Furious and determined that he would succeed in suppressing the revolt where so many other Romans had failed, Crassus revived the horrific punishment of decimation. Horrified troops were divided into groups of 10 and drew straws. The poor soul who drew the shortest straw was then beaten to death by the other 9. This draconian practice had the intended effect, and with renewed zeal, Crassus's army began to box in and get the better of Spartacus. By 71 BCE, Crassus won a major and decisive battle in which Spartacus was killed, though he was never identified, and took 6,000 prisoners. Burnishing his own reputation for savagery, Crassus ordered that all 6,000 be crucified on the road leading to Rome as a stark warning to all that would defy Rome. This final battle, the one that essentially ended the Spartacus War, should have been a crowning achievement for Crassus. But a few thousand survivors out of the 100,000 troops managed to escape and make a desperate break for the north. They ran headlong into Pompey, who was marching south after concluding the Sertorius War. The delighted Pompey quickly wiped out the final survivors of the Third Servile War, then gleefully sent a letter to the Senate to let them know that it was he, Pompey the Great, had arrived just in time to save the day and end the war. The Senate fawned all over Pompey, and just like that, the younger man scooped Crassus's great success and appropriated all the glory for himself. To make matters worse, the Senate voted Pompey a second triumph for his victories in Spain. Crassus fumed, but Crassus was also a pragmatist. He had unrealized ambitions, and he wasn't going to realize them by wishing them into existence. Despite the unprecedented popularity of his younger rival, Crassus had made himself well known, and this, paired with his massive financial resources, made him a great candidate to stand for the most prestigious office of the Roman Republic. To make things even better, he was just old enough to qualify for the office, but Pompey, even after his 5 long years of fighting in Spain, was still several years shy of eligibility. Crassus had a chance to get the high office before his rival, but this was no issue for Pompey, who simply asked for and received an exception to the rules. While this ruffled some feathers, the unsurpassed popularity of Pompey meant that his election was guaranteed. There is an irony that the man who did so much to fight for Sulla and to advance the Sullan agenda was the prime beneficiary of the suspension of the same rules that Sulla had fought so hard to install. Pompey and Crassus were duly elected, and in 70 BCE, they served as consuls. the two most prominent men in all of Rome, side by side. One had accomplished more in his young career than most Romans did in a lifetime. The other had survived tremendous hardship but built himself into the richest man in Rome and still had substantial, unrealized ambition. His election as consul in 70 BCE was well before he was legally allowed to stand for the office. This had become a pattern for Pompey, accomplishing so much so early that the standard conventions just didn't seem to apply to him. He certainly seemed to be convinced of his own destiny, and it's part of why he didn't mind so much when people were calling him Magnus or the Great when he was in his 20s. Now, with another decade or so of experience, the unsurpassed adoration of the people, the respect of the Senate, the consulship in hand, certainly Pompey could use this platform to do even greater things for the Senate and people of Rome. But as it turns out, his first consulship was unproductive. He didn't embark on an ambitious reform program. He didn't pass sweeping legislation, ease the suffering of the poor or the dispossessed, strengthen the fire code, sponsor a big program of festivals, or really do anything. At the surface, the reason given for this lack of accomplishment was the simmering rivalry and mutual distrust between Pompey and Crassus, his co-consul. The two clearly didn't get along, and their inability to cooperate meant that they got nothing done. Well, little done. But it's also worth considering another reason for Pompey's lack of accomplishment while consul. He ran for office not to do something with it, but simply for the prestige that winning brought. He had fought and commanded troops all over the Roman world, but he wasn't driven by a specific ideology. He wasn't fighting for any ethos or political program. He wasn't driven to protect anyone's ancient privileges or to upset the social order or to seize the state or anything. He was raised in the army camp of his father. It was what he knew. Having the office was more important than doing something with it. For all his great accomplishments, and by this point the career of Pompey was truly the stuff of legend, he also had almost no ideology guiding his actions other than the accumulation of honors and battlefield victories. This, ever so slightly, a crack in the foundation, as it reveals that, perhaps a bit surprisingly, Pompey had very little knack for politics, and the Romans were every bit as obsessed with politics as they were martial valor. But to be clear, he and Crassus definitely did not like one another, and that sure didn't help. Still, the two put aside their enmity long enough to make a few adjustments to Sulla's reforms. The dictator, ever the elitist snob, had transferred the oversight of the courts from the equites, the middle rung of the social hierarchy, to the senators, the top rung. The equites, it should be mentioned, were far from your ordinary middle-class citizens. Their name derived from the earliest days of Rome, when the fledgling city relied on citizen soldiers for defense and warfare. Every citizen was expected to provide their own equipment. The equites, the knights, were the people rich enough to sustain a horse in times of war, clearly a big step up in wealth above the average rank-and-file subsistence farmer that made up the bulk of Rome's armies early in its history. By the time of the late Republic, the equites counted among their ranks some of the wealthiest merchants in Rome, commerce being beneath the dignity of the senators. This group of people commanded enormous wealth and influence, but generally lacked the pedigree of their social betters, the patricians and senators. Control of the courts had been an important right granted to the equites in the class struggles that created so much division in the Roman world. Senators had proven an inability to hold themselves accountable, and even the most guilty senators had found themselves acquitted when the judge and jury were other senators. This had led to rampant corruption, but Sulla thought control of the Roman legal system as the exclusive prerogative of the senatorial order, believing them to be morally and intellectually superior in every way. Shifting the courts to the equites had been an important concession to ensure greater fairness in the system, and Sulla had wiped this reform out with a stroke of his stylus. Under Crassus and Pompey, this sullen action was quietly reversed, and once again the equites resumed control of the courts. The other significant accomplishment of the consuls was the reestablishment of the office of tribune of the plebs. This magistracy was another outflow of the conflict of orders, the time of great animosity between the various social strata that roiled Rome just after the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of the republic. The tribune of the plebs was an elected position tasked with ensuring the interests of the plebeians were being represented in the decisions of the state. It was a powerful position, one that had veto power over the actions of consuls and other magistrates. A tribune of the plebs could also call a gathering of the Senate and the People's Assembly and to propose legislation. The tribunate had been used as a platform to push through reform against the wishes of the senatorial class, as these people tended to only care about themselves. The rest of the citizenry be damned. The radical populists that had tried to force change on the Roman Republic had used the tribunate as their tool to do so, and because of this, Sulla had banned the post. Pompey and Crassus restored it as part of the system of government. I think in these actions you can really feel a bit more the fingerprint of Crassus than Pompey, because as time will tell, Crassus definitely had populist sensibilities. Or, in this action, perhaps we get a faint glimpse of Pompey's politics. Sulla had been an arch-conservative and viewed all his blood-soaked actions as necessary to restore the balance and stability of the Roman world. Sulla didn't pursue reform so much as restoration. He was an oligarch, and he came from that school of thought that the world of years ago was intrinsically better than the world of today, no matter how unfair the world of yesterday was to everyone that wasn't an elitist oligarch. By shifting the courts back to the equites and restoring the tribune of the plebs, Pompey and Crassus were showing a bit of a populist streak. Or maybe more cautiously, an understanding that Rome existed for more than the one percenters, so to speak. Remember, consuls could veto the actions of their colleagues, so both Pompey and Crassus had to agree on these reforms in order for them to pass. It was during his consulship that Pompey officially laid down his military command. By custom, equites who had fulfilled their term of military service came to the forum, leading their horse on foot. They would present themselves to the sitting censors and request formal discharge from the service. Always with a flair for popular spectacle, Pompey followed this custom, even as a consul, a senator, and an imperator. Leading his horse, the great general came before the censors. A huge crowd gathered to witness the great hero of the Republic humble himself to the authority of others. The senior censor, as tradition dictated, inquired, "Pompeius Magnus, I ask thee whether thou hast performed all the military services required by law." Pompey shouted his reply so all could hear, "I have performed them, and all under myself as imperator." The crowd roared in delight. The censors, moved by Pompey's personal appearance before them, shot to their feet and joined in the cheering. They then locked arms with the great man and personally accompanied him back to his home. The delighted crowd following, showing adulation on Pompey, a man who had needed to be praised and loved to feel truly comfortable. Besides, Pompey certainly knew that in times of crisis, the Senate would have him on speed dial as the man of the hour. Laying down his command was easy when he knew that he was the only real choice the next time Rome needed a hero. And given how often Rome got itself entangled in violent struggles, Rome always needed a hero. As his term of office ended, Pompey went into semi-retirement. He rarely went out in public, partly because when he did, throngs of admirers mobbed him wherever he went, and even for Pompey, a man who thrived on public adulation, a man who needed public adulation, the crowds grew a bit tiresome. Besides, he knew that to keep his reputation, he needed to maintain a little distance. Be aloof. Be the guy in the rated R movie, the guy you're not sure whether you like or not. You're not sure where he's coming from. Wait for the call to come. The call came pretty quickly. Just a few years after the end of his consulship, Rome was beset by another crisis. This one was neither a war against any foreign nation nor a rebellion against an ambitious general determined to be the next Marius or, for that matter, Sulla. Rather, threat facing Rome was one that had been festering for some time, growing steadily worse until it had become untenable. The pirates of the Mediterranean. Rome had never been much of a naval power. They relied on land armies to conquer, but the Republic was heavily dependent on merchant shipping. Its economy thrived on the international trade of all manner of goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond. More vitally, Rome relied on grain and produce from overseas to keep its people fed. The pirates had been causing havoc to the grain fleet, and Rome grew hungry and restive. Piracy hit Roman merchants in the pocketbooks and the Roman citizens in the stomach. Disruption to the merchant fleet posed a very serious threat indeed, and by the middle of the 1st century BCE, the threat of piracy had grown to epic proportions. The pirates were loosely based in Cilicia, the southern end of the Anatolian landmass, due south of the kingdom of our old friend Mithridates. These were the same pirates that Mithridates had sponsored to help drive the Romans crazy, but they existed, with or without the Pontic king. The Cilician pirates were a very dire threat to the stability of Rome. The Mediterranean pirates were a loosely affiliated group of outlaws and brigands that used their considerable naval skill to strike at unsuspecting targets, seizing cargoes and ransoming captives. In fact, back in 75 BCE, the pirates had taken captive none other than Julius Caesar. When he found out how much the pirates were seeking in ransom, he was outraged. They didn't value him enough, and he demanded that they more than double their asking price from 20 talents of silver to 50. A talent, by the way, is an ancient measure of weight, approximately 70 pounds, meaning that Caesar's family would need to scratch together nearly 2 tons of silver just to buy his release. Amused by this impetuous and arrogant young noble, his captors gleefully compiled, and a trusted friend was freed to go gather up the money to buy Caesar's freedom. He further amused the pirates, not by living in fear of them, but by jumping in to help them with their duties, cleaning here, hauling ropes and masts there, ordering them to be quiet when he found their noise a distraction. He was hardworking and diligent and arrogant, and the pirates took to their captive. He joked with them that when he was free, he would track them all down and crucify them. They all got a big laugh at this impetuous captive, and were almost sad to see him go when the ransom was duly provided. But still, 50 talents of silver was a fortune, and once his ransom was paid, the pirates released their captive and sized up their next opportunity. Surely it wouldn't be as fun. Except they shouldn't have dismissed his threats as jocular banter. Once freed from his captives, Caesar put together a crack squad, tracked down the pirates, raided their camp, seized back his ransom money, and crucified every last one of them, just as he said he would. But maybe out of some glimmer of affection for his former captives, he slit all their throats once on the cross as a tiny act of mercy. But that was just one crew among hundreds or thousands of such ships crisscrossing the Mediterranean. To make matters worse, the pirates would hire themselves out as allies to Rome's enemies. Cilician pirates fought against Rome for the likes of Mithridates and Sertorius. The civil wars had sapped Rome's energy and reduced its resources. At the same time, Rome's ascendancy in the international sphere had led to a diminution in traditional naval powers that might have served as a check on the pirates. In short, there was a bit of a power vacuum, and piracy went from bad to worse. Not only did the pirates raid shipping, but they also landed and sacked cities, sometimes ransoming entire populations at once. By the time Rome had finally decided to act, the pirates had sacked more than 400 cities, not only coastal cities, but also occasionally marching inland and laying waste to an unsuspecting town or village. And oh, how the money flowed in. Piracy was lucrative, extremely lucrative, so much so that the pirates often used silver-plated oars and cruised with elaborately dyed sails. They were arrogant, bold, and a total violent menace. The final outrage that spurred Rome to action was the abduction of the 2 sitting magistrates, along with their entire entourages. True to form, when the Romans finally decided to act, they did so with total commitment. Determined to rid the piracy menace once and for all, a tribune of the plebs, that ancient office so recently revived by Pompey and Crassus, determined that the normal system of checks and balances should be suspended and near total control and unlimited resources be invested in the hands of a specially appointed commander. This leader would command 200 ships, appoint 15 legates, essentially deputy generals, and have at-large proconsular authority that followed him wherever he went, so that his authority was always going to supersede that of any other person with whom he came into contact. This authority was not limited to the sea lanes, but also extended 50 miles inland around all the Mediterranean. Even more than a consul, who had limits on their power, this specifically created command amounted to a floating dictatorship. This was a kingship in everything but name, and it was specially designed for the only person in Rome that could flaunt convention except a command that was so clearly monarchical: Pompey the Great. Despite his connections to the aristocracy and his unsurpassed status in the Republican Rome, the nature of his command and the authority it granted him shocked the conservative members of the Senate, and it drew staunch opposition. Even Metellus Pius, Pompey's co-commander in Hispania during the Sertorian War, was firmly opposed. But the popular assembly managed to circumvent the Senate, pass the law, and invest Pompey with his extraordinary command. When Pompey came to the forum to offer sacrifices for a successful command, the crowds poured out in an ecstatic display of adoration. To prove their devotion, the People's Assembly convened and voted to heap even more resources on him. The number of ships was up to 500, and the total number of troops that those ships would convey was raised to 120,000 soldiers and 5,000 cavalry. Keep in mind, naval warfare was rarely fought ship to ship, but rather ships would ram or tie themselves to one another, and soldiers would charge onto the enemy ship for brutal hand-to-hand combat. But with the cavalry aboard this flotilla, Pompey now had the ability to track pirates ashore, should they seek to escape his justice by fleeing inland. Pompey assumed his command in 67 BCE and measured up the considerable challenge that confronted him. At least in Hispania, his adversary had been a land force easy enough to track, if not easy to defeat. And that took 5 years and was only possible when Sertorius had been betrayed by a jealous subordinate. In this new endeavor, Pompey had to account for nearly 1,000 pirates, independently operating, highly mobile, and of far superior naval skill than anything his Greenhorn Navy could rely upon. It was expected to be a long, arduous, and almost impossible task. But Pompey was a gifted strategist, and he devised a plan that offered great promise. His first step was to swarm the shipping lanes, surround any pirates that could be caught up in the net, and obliterate them. This was duly done, and it shocked everyone when it took a mere 40 days to accomplish. Grain and produce began pouring into Rome, and the immediate crisis subsided in just a couple of weeks. But Pompey, of course, was determined to solve the problem not just now, but forever. His solution was simple, elegant, and astonishingly effective. He, essentially, lined his ships up and swept across the Mediterranean from west to east, driving the pirates back towards Cilicia and ensuring none slipped through his net. Some pirates, understanding their game was up, proactively presented themselves to Pompey and duly surrendered. He seized their ships to prevent them from being able to resume their brigandry, but otherwise allowed them to leave with their families and possessions. Pompey even granted them inland holdings to settle. He was after the elimination of piracy, but not necessarily the death of the pirates. Besides, forgiving someone put them in your debt, and Pompey used his reputation for clemency to win new clients for himself. For those that fled, though, Pompey's net tightened until his remaining adversaries were all in Cilicia. Some waited to do battle from their ships. Others took to the pirates' coastal cities, prepared to defend their homelands. Pompey, commanding a massive force, easily outmanned the seaborne pirates, destroying their ships, taking prisoners, and eradicating the menace from the seas. Next, he gathered his troops and attacked the various pirate strongholds. These cities he reduced with ease. All in all, he had taken on command with an unprecedented authority and resources and solved for Rome an existential and intractable problem. And he did it in less than 3 months. Pompey the Great indeed. How on earth to follow up that victory? How about definitively ending one of Rome's longest and most complicated wars in its entire history? It was time for a showdown between Pompey and another of our old friends, Mithridates VI Eupator, or as we've gotten to know him, Mithridates the Great. Hot off the successes of his pirate campaign, Pompey once again used his allies in the tribunate to pass a law shifting the command of the Roman forces in the Third Mithridatic War away from its present commanders and entirely to himself. The leader of the Roman forces at the time, a guy we've met before named Lucius Licinius Lucullus, was furious at having his command stripped from him. Lucullus, who had fought side by side with Sulla and emerged as a leader of the post-Sullan conservative faction, had been grinding away against the wily Pontic king for 7 years. As we've seen in the previous episodes, Mithridates was no ordinary foe, and combined with his brother-in-law, Tigranes the Great, king of Armenia, he was able to draw on almost unlimited resources to fight to the death in this struggle with his great and eternal foe, Rome. Lucullus had amassed an impressive record in this campaign, and through his methodical work, had reduced and boxed in Mithridates. For the first time in a long time, ultimate victory was in sight. And along came Pompey, with his sterling reputation and his knack for showing up at the right place at the right time, ready to swoop in and steal a victory from Lucullus just like he'd stolen one from Crassus. For his part, Pompey indulged in the farce that this command was against his wishes. He wanted to be seen as the reluctant hero, only dragged into the war to serve the needs and desires of others and against his personal wishes. It's just in service of the state. The biographer Plutarch has Pompey exclaiming, "Alas for my endless tasks! How much better it were to be an unknown man, if I am never to cease from military service and cannot lay aside this load of envy and spend my time in the country with my wife." For all these hollow pretensions of ambivalence or reluctance, Pompey gleefully assumed command. Lucullus, still furious, seethed over his stolen glory. The two men met to go over the details of the change of command. At first, they were civil. Lucullus had served as consul before Pompey, but Pompey had twice triumphed. Each had to acknowledge the prestige and accomplishments of the other. But as their meeting wore on, the pretense of civility eroded and broke into open hostility. The two shouted at one another and had to be restrained in the commotion. The meeting between two of the late Republic's greatest generals produced nothing but animosity. Lucullus retired to his palatial estates in Rome and wallowed in legendary and almost obscene luxury, bitter until his death in around 56 BCE. But that was years in the future. As time would tell, Lucullus would have plenty of opportunity to needle Pompey and to be a thorn in his side. We covered the Mithridatic campaigns of Pompey in the final episode about Mithridates, and there's no need to repeat them here in great detail. If you haven't listened to those episodes, please do. Mithridates is awesome. But while we focus on the final years and days of Mithridates, it's also worth adding a few comments about Pompey's specific strategy. Just as he did with the pirates, Pompey worked to methodically encircle and strangle his adversary. He reduced territory after territory and used his newfound naval supremacy to put a chokehold on Mithridates. One of his greatest accomplishments in these waning moments of the Mithridatic Wars was his success severing the ties between Tigranes, the king of Armenia, and the Pontic king, as well as successfully engaging with Mithridates' son, Pharnaces, who ended up being the one that, more or less, finished off Mithridates. So while Pompey's military leadership was certainly notable, he did win the war with a combination of military and savvy diplomacy. And rather than reduce the whole region to ruin, he managed to save something for those that survived the conquests. Along the way, he managed to win for Rome new allies and new dependent client kings. What started as Mithridates' rebellion against Roman influence ended up with Pompey putting the whole of the region further under Roman power. At the same time as he was waging his campaign against Mithridates, Pompey enjoyed his position and the massive resources that he commanded. He summoned foreign kings to travel to him and pay their respects. He sent expeditionary forces into new areas to bring more and more territory under control. He appointed magistrates, pardoned some people for past offenses, or revoked pardons previously granted to others. He annexed territory for Rome and established new provinces, and generally redrew the entire map as it pleased him. Far away from Rome and its burning suspicion of monarchy, Pompey easily adopted the style and manner of a king. He used his power to completely reorganize the eastern territories and to project Roman hegemony to lofty new heights. In 63 BCE, when Mithridates finally died, Pompey had accomplished the conclusion of a war that had raged off and on all the way back to that fateful day in 88 BCE when the Pontic king had organized the mass slaughter of Romans known today as the Asiatic Vespers. Magnanimous in his victory, Pompey ordered that Mithridates be buried with great pomp and respect as befitting so noble a king and fierce a warrior. He sent the corpse of the dead king back to the Pontic capital of Sinope, and Mithridates was interred with great solemnity. As mentioned in the Mithridatic episodes, Pompey did take his dead foe's cloak, said to have been worn by none other than Alexander the Great. Wearing this sacred garment gave Pompey yet one more connection to the great Macedonian, and Pompey was delighted to be putting his resume up next to Alexander's and find it favorably comparable. This wasn't as delusional as it might seem now. Pompey had played a decisive role in so many key campaigns against enemies both foreign and domestic, and he was helping establish Rome as a genuine empire. A prince, an honest-to-God prince. The post-Mithridatic Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean world was chaotic. Pompey, with his penchant for organization, resolved to bring order to the region. After the conclusion of the Mithridatic Wars, Pompey established or re-established kingdoms, restored deposed kings to their thrones, settled disputes between rival claimants to various kingdoms, and generally did his best to just calm everything down. One of the notable Pompeian settlements arose when he intervened in a roiling succession dispute in the kingdom of Judea. This is something that we will cover more when we meet our next The Great, but for now, it's worth mentioning that Pompey's intervention led to the kingdom of Judea becoming a Roman client state. Pompey made hundreds of decisions, great and small, about the status of kingdoms, cities, Roman provinces, even individual rulers, governors, magistrates, everything. In the shattered Pontic Empire, several lesser kingdoms were established. Colchis was restored as a kingdom. Pontus and Bithynia were merged. Cappadocia was reinstated. The Bosporan kingdom was given its independence. Cilicia, that former hotbed of pirates, was reorganized. He put his mark on everything. And all the while, ambassadors traveled to him to pay their respects and ensure good standing with the Romans. Unlike the Greco-Macedonian world, cobbled together by Alexander's careening conquests, the campaigns of Pompey were conducted with long-term stability in mind, with clearly defined boundaries and client kings who owed their thrones to Rome, and with tribute payments set up to come pouring in. All he would need to do was to get the ever-grateful Senate to rubber stamp his eastern settlements, which they had done time and time again throughout his sprawling career. All the visiting dignitaries, all the newly established client kings, they all showered Pompey with gifts: gold, silver, clothes, fragrances, massages, mimosas, fine leather goods. Added to the normal plunder that came with the reduction of the Pontic Empire, the seizure of Mithridates' treasury and possessions, Pompey was setting up to command a personal fortune that would rival any Roman. Well, any Roman not named Crassus. He poured considerable wealth back into his troops, lavishing them with gifts and bonuses and making them very rich in their own rights. All of Pompey's eastern settlements were ostensibly for the benefit of Rome. Taxes and tribute would pour in, and Roman hegemony replaced and strengthened that of Pontus. But no one benefited more than Pompey himself. Kings owed their thrones to him, not to Rome. His power and influence, already at such great height in Rome, spread east and around the Roman world. To further cement his position as the leading man of the Republic, his army was veteran, victors of multiple campaigns. More crucially, they were fiercely loyal to their commander. He led them to victory and to personal fortunes. Their loyalty was not to the state, but to Pompey. As he prepared to head home, he had a powerful army at his back and kings at his feet. In many ways, he resembled an Achaemenid king of kings more than a Roman proconsul. Rumors swirled before Pompey's arrival back in Italy. The skeptics that had been concerned with giving so much power to one man now wrung their hands in worry. Pompey, they whispered, would land his army, march on Rome, and install himself as the next Sulla, and there was no reason he couldn't do so. Except one, really. He had no interest in being a dictator. As discussed previously, Pompey was light on ideology. He wasn't a radical. When Pompey landed in Italy in 62 BCE, he arrived in the port of Brundisium. The people poured out in huge numbers to greet the greatest hero of Rome. His popularity reached unprecedented heights. That is, with the common people. The elites in the Senate were dubious. Skeptical of unlimited power and popularity, the upper rungs of the oligarchy were cool to Pompey, unsure of his motives and afraid of so much power and prestige being tied up in one person. The Romans were oddly simultaneously fascinated and repulsed by power. But Pompey called his troops together, praised them for their service and loyalty, and disbanded them. As he made his way to Rome, crowds mobbed him along the route. But one person was not at his side: his wife, Mucia, whom he had divorced by letter just before he arrived back in Rome. Pompey then was not only the hero of the people, he was suddenly the most eligible bachelor in the Roman world. Skeptical though the Senate might have been on his one-man reorganization of the East, they couldn't deny the scope of his accomplishments. Pompey was duly awarded a triumph. now his third, for his victory over Mithridates. Traditionally, a triumph was a one-day affair, but this, Pompey's third, which he celebrated on September 29th, 61 BCE, his 45th birthday, was so lavish, the amount of wealth so extensive that, scandalously, it spread to 2 days. Pompey further shocked Roman sensitivities by embracing imagery, clothing, and customs of his vanquished foes, sparking whispers with the elite that Pompey had embraced Asian effeminacy. This was a common charge from a xenophobic people, an ancient trope that continues to echo. Pompey showered largesse on the people, including paying for the construction of a massive new theater, the first permanent theater in Roman history. The Theater of Pompey was an architectural marvel. More than a theater, it contained public gardens, shaded porticos, exhibitions of fine art commandeered on his foreign campaigns, flowing fountains, and even a Senate house. It was huge, easily dominating its neighborhood, the glory of Pompey displayed in gleaming marble for all Romans to see. Naturally, some stodgy old patricians hated it, but for the adoring crowds, the entertainment and the luxury the theater brought to the people was just one more reason to love Rome's first citizen. Unfortunately for Pompey, the love of the masses and the respect of the Senate were two very different things. Keep in mind, even though Pompey had fought for the state, the Senate was stacked with Sulla's partisans, and Sulla was nothing if not deeply conservative. There was an inherent conflict between the glory of Pompey and the prestige of the Senate. They didn't reconcile. Pompey was no stranger to political tussles, but he was about to encounter a very different kind of obstinance, one it would be difficult to overcome through sheer force of personality and the unrelenting adulation of the people. For the first time, a faction would organize itself with the sole goal of checking Pompey's ambitions and to make the general's life miserable. At the same time, his on-again, off-again rival Crassus had his own frustrations. Tired of Pompey always sweeping in and scooping up the glory, Crassus went out of his way to prevent Pompey from getting what he wanted. The two leading men of Rome stared across at one another and saw the other as an obstacle to their ambition. They were at a bit of an impasse, neither able to fully do what they wanted, but both with further ambitions yet to realize. There aren't many lulls in the career of Pompey, but when they happen, we should take advantage of them, because, spoiler alert, this deadlock is about to be resolved by the entrance of the stage of a young up-and-comer who is going to change everything. With that in mind, thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one. We are about to meet again Julius Caesar and the First Triumvirate.